Good afternoon to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to today's tropical weather outlook for July 30th, 2026. Today, we're going to mainly talk about El Nino, which continues to break records with daily sea surface temperatures, and more strengthening is going to happen if you can believe it. And the general pattern is what is definitely fueling the many strong hurricanes and typhoons that we are starting to see pop up in the Pacific, some of which are active right now. And it is all hand in hand, and it is all thanks to the record strong El Nino that we have right now that is continuing to take shape. So we're going to talk about all of that today, and we certainly have our hands full on this El Nino update. So let's get started by taking a look at the latest sea surface temperature anomaly graph of the entire world. This is the map that I typically look at, especially when we do these El Nino updates. Why? Because it gives you a view of the entire Pacific, and quite a nice view as well. And you could really see just how expansive this El Nino is, especially on the world stage. And it really kind of puts into perspective that El Nino is really a driving force when it comes to world weather patterns. It literally affects the entire jet stream and atmospheric response of the entire world. And of course, comes with that the atmospheric response of warmth, which translates to warmer sea surface temperature anomalies as well throughout the entire world too. And obviously, some of that also comes from other influences as well. And, El Nino is probably playing into other influences as well. And we could have a whole other discussion and probably a debate about that. But I'm not focusing on that today. Mainly focusing on the strength of El Nino right now, and you can see it just continues to get even stronger here. Many of these anomalies well above 2, even 3 degrees Celsius above normal, to even reaching in many widespread parts here of the eastern tropical Pacific, equatorial Pacific, as much as 4 degrees Celsius above normal. And you're really starting to see that pronounced tongue stretching from South America. And probably a lot of these, especially really warm anomalies that are now really beginning to surface their way and appear on the surface charts from the extremely deep and warm subsurface pool that we have below, which is really helping fuel the El Nino. And that's probably the biggest reason why we have such a record-setting event taking place right now. And I'm going to show you the subsurface sea surface temperature anomalies in just a little bit, but you're really starting to see the reflection of that now here. And the general tropical Pacific here, and we'll actually talk about the Atlantic in a second, the general tropical Pacific just continues to remain well above normal. And of course, a lot of that has to do with the El Nino here, but even in the eastern Pacific off the Baja Peninsula, we have this really, really warm patch of sea surface temperature anomalies well above normal, in fact, nearly record-breaking, and just in general throughout the entire Pacific, including the Western Pacific too. And obviously, all of these very warm anomalies are helping to fuel very intense hurricanes and typhoons. And now that we are especially getting deeper into the year, and as the northern hemisphere continues to heat up with tropical activity, these storms are just taking advantage of the very, very warm, near record-breaking sea surface temperature anomalies that we have here throughout the Pacific. And we've seen that over the past week alone, multiple Category 5s here. Hurricane Genevieve, one of them in the eastern Pacific, and then we obviously also have very, very strong Typhoon Dolphin, which is also taking advantage of the very warm sea surface temperature anomalies we have in the Western Pacific, and the storms themselves being fueled by the atmospheric response due to this very, very strong El Nino. But also in the Atlantic here, interestingly enough, you're starting to see the sea surface temperature anomalies warm up too, especially in the eastern Atlantic. And I really should get a comparison map from earlier in the year, because if you remember, especially earlier on, a lot of people were saying that the Atlantic would be cooler than normal this year. We would have a negative AMO pattern set up, and it looks like that is not the case anymore. The eastern Atlantic, especially here, has warmed up quite a bit in the last few weeks, and we're starting to get that more classic positive AMO horseshoe shape with warm anomalies stretching all the way from the northern Atlantic down into the eastern Atlantic and then seeping down into the MDR. But interestingly enough, we also have these cooler anomalies beginning to show up along the equatorial Atlantic as well, kind of setting the stage here for an Atlantic Nina versus a very, very warm equatorial Pacific with a record-setting El Nino. So that is a kind of interesting dynamic here, and we will see whether or not these warmer sea surface temperature anomalies beginning to show up in the tropical Atlantic maybe have an effect on the peak of the hurricane season this year, since we are about to approach it. We are in the final days of July, and as we start to get into August and September, obviously the tropical Atlantic begins to heat up quite a bit, and we'll actually talk about that a little bit more later on, and of course in the coming days as well, since I have more to say about that, and I'll again go more into depth on that later. But interesting dynamic we're starting to see here show up in the Atlantic, and we will definitely continue to monitor this. Moving on, though, to how the sea surface temperature anomalies are specifically in the equatorial Pacific related to the ENSO regions, and all of them just continue to warm up here, and this is the look of the relative SST anomalies here. The Nino 3.4 reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius right now, it seems like the latest that the chart goes up to, although it's probably warmer than that at this point. And the regular raw sea surface temperature anomalies, as I'll show you in a little bit, go well beyond that. We're above 2 degrees Celsius with the raw sea surface temperature anomalies. The Nino 3.4 continues to warm up, and the Nino 3, or the Nino 1 and 2, on the relative sea surface temperature anomalies already reaching above 3 degrees Celsius above normal. The one outlier, though, that I find interesting is the Nino 4, which has actually cooled down since June. And you can see the Nino 3.4 generally encompasses here the central and western Pacific, I believe. Maybe that has to do with the fact that we've been getting quite a bit of tropical storm activity, and probably maybe, coming from Typhoon Dolphin a little bit. And that's also kind of representative of just the natural cycle of these storms. The main thing that they do is take all of the heat energy we have in the ocean and kind of dispense it into the atmosphere. So maybe that's why we're seeing the Nino 4 come down a little bit. But one thing it is certainly helping to create is this very Eastern Pacific-based El Nino dynamic that we have right now. And when we actually look at the raw sea surface temperature anomalies, and this is actually more in line with this graph here, because this is basically all of the data from the NOAA Coral Reef Watch map, but just, graphed. And I show this map pretty much every single week whenever I do these El Nino updates. So you've seen it before, very, very likely, unless this is your first time. If so, welcome. But the latest value, 2.3 degrees Celsius right now with the Nino 3.4. And it's kind of holding steady here for the last week or so, but still just continuing to warm up here pretty much since the beginning of the year, especially since May. Since May, we were only at 1 degree Celsius, although we were still in moderate territory, but now we are close to 2.3 degrees Celsius, even nearing 2.5. We're starting to get there. We are well above super El Nino threshold. But definitely more warm anomalies coming along the way, because as I described before, the Nino 1 and 2 regions are especially very warm, and on the raw sea surface temperature anomaly graph, if you can believe it, we are already at 4 degrees Celsius above normal, and pretty much that represents here the warm, very, very warm sea surface temperature anomalies that are in the far eastern Pacific, closer to South America. That is where the Nino 1 and 2 region is. And just generally with the natural progression of El Nino, we see more of these very warm sea surface temperature anomalies continue to push westward. So we are starting to see some 4 degrees Celsius anomalies solidly showing up in the mix. So that is absolutely going to help, and probably eventually translate to the Nino 3.4 as well. So if you already think that us reaching 2.3 degrees Celsius with the anomalies is insane, well, we still have more to go. And especially looking at the sea surface temperature subsurface warmth pool, this is pretty much just looking at the equatorial Pacific through a cross-section, going straight down instead of looking at it on the surface like we do with the graph that I typically show you And this is the source of energy that is providing all of the very warm sea surface temperature anomalies that we are seeing right now. Massive amounts of warmth below the surface here in the Pacific, with a lot of these anomalies as much as 6, 7, even 8 degrees Celsius above normal, maybe even some reaching 9 degrees Celsius above normal. And in terms of raw sea surface temperatures, it's probably, not that different from the actual raw sea surface temperatures we have on the actual surface, but just the general, way the ocean is set up, sea surface temperatures, the temperature of the ocean generally gets cooler as we go deeper, naturally, as, the sun, kind of strikes the ocean less, and you get less warmth from the direct rays of the sun. But just the amount of heat that we have built in the ocean right now from this El Nino is insane. And there's clearly still a lot left in the tank here. Now, you are starting to see some of these cooler anomalies develop here in the Western Pacific, and that is definitely probably the early signs of, maybe things to talk about next year once we get beyond this very record strong El Nino, hint, hint, maybe La Nina. And that's kind of also a part of the natural cycle as well of ENSO. Very typically, especially once we get past these very strong El Nino events, we very often immediately go back to La Nina status. It's kind of just the natural progression of ENSO. And there's kind of scientific papers and all that describe it much better than I do, but we're kind of starting to see that natural cycle here begin to appear. Much more of these cooler anomalies developing further to the west in the Western Pacific. And also that, too, part of that is coming from, a lot of heat energy that's being choked off in the Western Pacific, thanks to all the typhoon activity we're seeing there. But this is definitely an interesting signal here that we're starting to see. But right now, the amount of heat in the atmosphere or heat in the ocean that we have left for this El Nino is still quite incredible. Lots of very warm anomalies here that are yet to surface, on top of the fact that we already have just absolutely record-breaking, values here in the Pacific. And this is, the latest sea surface temperature anomalies. I mean, just look at it throughout the entire equatorial Pacific here, pretty much stretching, especially closer towards the Central Pacific, probably closer towards the Nino 3 and 4 region. 3.4, well, yes, the Nino 3 and 4, but, the 3.4, which is the combination of the two, and that's where we monitor the actual strength of El Nino. We especially see these record warm values here, and this is probably only going to continue and get even, more crazy once we have more of this warmth here that is still lurking below the surface, that will surface eventually, and eventually that is going to lead us to seeing probably the strongest El Nino in history this year. And it's pretty much set in stone at this point. And the climate models have been hinting at it for a while. They've been hinting at it from the start of this year. And now it is basically coming to fruition. And just to kind of put into perspective what we should see at the peak of this El Nino, here's the CFS Nino 3.4 forecast, and we get above 3.5 degrees Celsius here. We even kind of start reaching towards 4 degrees Celsius on this forecast, and that is just absolutely insane. Really, it's quite remarkable. But we'll see whether or not we actually get as strong as these values show. But wouldn't surprise me in the very least if we hit 3 degrees Celsius. And this is just the relative Nino forecast. The actual, Nino 3.4 region itself, you can imagine we're probably reaching well above 4 degrees Celsius if we were to look at the CFS. But even reaching 3 at this point, I think, is very possible. And given how much warmth we still have left in the tank, we probably have a few more weeks of warming left. And I wouldn't be surprised if we hit 3, maybe even get as warm as 3.5 degrees Celsius with this strength of the El Nino when all is said and done. And again, that is indeed going to be record-breaking. Looking at the SOI, going more into the, atmospheric aspect of this El Nino right now, and this is really, only continuing to help fuel further strengthening. The SOI right now, the latest value is negative 26.79 with the 30-day average, and the 90-day average as well, negative 21. So very, very negative values with the SOI. And that is positive news when it comes to El Nino strengthening, because negative SOI correlates to pressure patterns in the Pacific that favor El Nino. And again, the more negative values we get, the stronger the atmospheric response that we are seeing with this El Nino, which in turn probably will allow for more strengthening, and certainly something that is going to help the SOI here as well continue to remain very negative over the next few weeks. Looking at the zonal wind anomalies here in the Pacific, and today I actually decided let's show you the full graph here, the actual map of how the zonal winds here look like across the Pacific. Usually I show you that graph of the forecast specifically for the Nino, well, specifically for the equatorial Pacific here. I show you it based on on a time scale forecast, but this is the actual, map of the entire thing itself. And let's just show you here over the next few weeks. By the way, the model is the European AI model. And you can just see here across the entire Pacific, especially here along the equator, all oranges and reds, and especially some browns and pinks showing up here in the Western Pacific. This is probably going to lead to even more strong typhoon activity, and this takes us out to mid-August, and you can see these anomalies, especially here along the equator and in the Central Pacific, very close to the Nino 3.4, strengthening even further. So that's probably going to take these anomalies up a notch even more, and we're probably going to see another very strong burst of strengthening here coming with this El Nino in the next few weeks. But when you especially see these very, very strong westerly winds here, that's probably going to especially once again help fuel lots of Pacific typhoon activity, especially in the Western Pacific. And you can argue especially the very strong westerly winds right now is what helped fuel storms like Typhoon Dolphin, which we are seeing, and it is an utter monster of a super typhoon that is going to be an ace maker, an ace machine, and probably, continue the trend of the Western Pacific, probably going to have among one of their highest ace-producing seasons this year, no doubt, and that pattern continues well into August. So we should continue to expect the Pacific, especially the Western Pacific here, to remain very active well into August, and more strengthening here, more warming of the ENSO regions as we continue to have very strong westerly wind anomalies. And that's going to take the Nino 3.4 to even higher heights in terms of sea surface temperature anomalies, and probably even more records broken here, and probably fueling all of this as well. And kind of just goes to show the atmospheric response of this whole El Nino is the rising branch related to the MJO and velocity potential. And Ben Knowles tweeting about it today. And he mentions the rising branch of the Pacific Walker circulation has become an immovable behemoth. And, all of the greens here, once again, represent rising motion in the atmosphere, which helps fuel favorable conditions in the atmosphere for tropical activity. And, of course, also helps fuel the atmosphere to, respond with westerly winds, especially along the equator. So all of these things are related. And over the next few weeks here, they are all going to allow for more El Nino strengthening and more record crazy activity here with the tropics in the Pacific. And then he also mentions the Atlantic as well, which on the flip side, on the very opposite side, he says will likely stay hurricane-free for weeks with hostile upper-level winds tearing apart what would be storms. And we'll see whether or not that does happen. Especially as we get towards, late August here, and we start getting towards the peak of hurricane season. We'll see whether or not, atmospheric conditions, remain extremely hostile, or whether or not things kind of loosen up a little bit and we start to see some tropical Atlantic activity. And I'll touch upon that more in just a little bit. But lots of activity happening, and lots of activity in the tropics-wise coming more than likely here in the next few weeks. And again, just to recap what we have so far, Hurricane Genevieve. Obviously, we talked about this a lot, especially earlier in the week. It became a very, very strong hurricane, reached a peak at Category 5 intensity. Super Typhoon Dolphin, Category 4 strength right now, but it is probably going to re-strengthen in a little bit, and I'll show you probably once again on a re-strengthening phase here, and it's going to probably once again push the upper levels of Category 5 intensity and be an ace grinder for the Western Pacific for at least the next week or so. And then we have another invest here, and believe it or not, more activity to watch in the Western Pacific beyond Dolphin, and probably some other activity coming up as well in the Eastern Pacific in about a week or so after Genevieve. And obviously, probably one of the main culprits of that here being the MJO, which will be stuck in the Pacific. So you can only imagine that's going to help fuel quite a bit of activity. So here's the latest on Hurricane Genevieve, focusing back here on the Eastern Pacific right now. Continuing to weaken in the meanwhile. Genevieve on a weakening trend, and we obviously had Fausto, which was near Hawaii, but that has completely died off and no longer on the map. But we still have Hurricane Genevieve for the time being. Maximum sustained winds at 80 miles per hour, minimum pressure at 980 millibars, and Genevieve is going to continue to weaken here as it moves on off to the west-northwest. So no need to be worried about that. I did skip over this map though. This is kind of looking at the Pacific as a whole right now, just to show you all the activity that we do have. And you can see Genevieve here in the Eastern Pacific, and then well off to the west here, you can see Dolphin. And I'll show you a better, picture here of Dolphin. Actually, let's show you it right now. This is the latest look at Dolphin in the Western Pacific. And you can see here, underwent an eyewall replacement cycle earlier, as after it looked like a very, very beautiful and stunning typhoon yesterday. But you could see the CDO is becoming more circular once again, and the eye is slowly beginning to warm here and clear out. So this is probably going to strengthen once again, and once again will probably become a very high-end Category 5 storm, maybe 180, maybe even 190 miles an hour, maybe even stronger if this is able to strengthen and hold off any other eyewall replacement cycle that'll happen. And looking at the forecast here from the ensembles for the next week, Dolphin is probably going to continue to strengthen and remain a very, very powerful hurricane for quite a long time. And eventually it's going to move towards the west here, and we will have to watch in China and maybe southern Japan and Korea are going to have to keep a very close eye out on Dolphin for potential impacts in roughly a week to 10 days time. And I saw a map here earlier that roughly this region encompassing South Korea, southern Japan, and China is roughly populated by 100 million people. So lots of eyes are going to be needed on the tropics here in the Western Pacific over the next few weeks. More than likely, you would imagine, as this gets further out in time, Dolphin will probably begin to gradually weaken as it loses steam after, expending so much energy here in the atmosphere. Once again, thanks to the very, very warm sea surface temperatures that we have right now in the Pacific. But it's still going to remain a powerful storm, and probably very likely a powerful storm for quite a while, up until it makes landfall here, which right now seems to be roughly maybe in China, maybe towards southern Japan, and still some ensembles here aiming towards Korea. Those look like to be the main areas we will be watching for right now. And I'm also sure that as well, we will probably have some hurricane chasers out in those areas preparing themselves for Dolphin once it does approach. But then the question and the conversation beyond that will be, look at the ensembles here showing even more activity following behind Dolphin. So the Western Pacific, man, is just continuing to crank out storm after storm after storm, and probably more powerful storms to come beyond just Dolphin as well. Moving on to the Eastern Pacific, though, you can see here the ensembles indicating Genevieve, which will obviously continue to move harmlessly out to sea and eventually die off in about a few days. And then eventually something else might form in the Eastern Pacific, moving into the Central Pacific here, and there are a few ensembles showing potentially a stronger outcome. So maybe we might have another hurricane in our hands, and that roughly happens over the next week as well. And then yet another signal here popping up probably beyond 10 days, more towards the eastern Pacific, although nothing really looking like it'll be a land threat right now. So lots of activity here expected in the eastern Pacific, although none of it land threatening just yet. So obviously that's a good thing. But I will say, especially with when I showed you the sea surface temperature anomalies, very warm here closer to Mexico earlier. Keep a very wary eye out for that, because once we get later in the season and we start to see much more troughing here in the western half of the United States, and we start to get more of these, far eastern Pacific forming storms that, sometimes recurve off to the northeast and move straight into Mexico. That tends to be a very popular track that we see late in the season. We have very, very warm sea surface temperature anomalies, in store for that region. So Mexico, likely not going to stay impact-free throughout the rest of the hurricane season, but at least for now, things are looking non-threatening just yet. But maybe we might have to watch here once again for Hawaii, maybe with this next signal. So lots to watch here in the tropics here in the Pacific over the next 2 weeks. And then finally, the Atlantic. A lot of people kind of writing off the Atlantic here, and no especially strong signals showing up right now, but there do seem to be a few things, some energy here in the western Atlantic, one ensemble here in the Gulf that's kind of going a little crazy, and then one ensemble here as well in the western Atlantic off the southeast coast, moving to the east. And then there also are some ensembles here trying to show some activity, maybe popping up in the MDR. I've actually seen some talk about that on social media. Maybe we might get something here in the MDR as we get towards next week or so. It's August. We're starting to get closer in time towards the peak of the hurricane season, and as we get towards August, climatology-wise, activity starts to become more favored in the eastern tropical Atlantic. So maybe there might be something to this. Even though it's El Nino, I don't expect that the tropics in the MDR here is going to be completely shut down for the entire season. There are some people that do believe that, but I don't believe that necessarily. I don't know. I think once we get towards the middle and latter parts of August here, with these tropical waves that continue to move on off the coast of Africa, eventually one or two of them are going to find favorable enough conditions that we will see development. Things are looking very quiet right now, and obviously a lot of that has to do with El Nino, but a lot of that also has to do with climatology. So I do think over the next few weeks, as we progress into August, we will start to see more signals here appear in the Atlantic, and maybe that's the beginnings of what is beginning to show up right now here on the ensembles map of the Google AI. Obviously, though, we will watch and see whether or not more models begin to latch onto it. But for now, nothing major showing up in the Atlantic. We are mainly focusing, though, on the Pacific, and of course, this record-strong El Nino, which will only continue to strengthen further. With that being said, though, I'm going to wrap it up for today's discussion. I hope you guys enjoyed what you saw today. If you did, I would really appreciate if you like this video, comment, and subscribe to the channel, especially if you like these El Nino updates. We will definitely continue to do more of these, probably at least once a week, maybe more, especially as things continue to get interesting here as we get into the meat and potatoes of the tropic season, especially in the northern hemisphere. So make sure to stay tuned. And most importantly, if you decide to subscribe, I would really appreciate if you turn on the notification bell as well, so you can get videos the moment I upload them. Thanks for watching. Enjoy the rest of your day. Stay safe. Peace, love, and kindness to you all. I'll be back with more tomorrow.